Get off the lake right now." That was the very first thing she yelled at my guests before they'd even set down a single fishing pole. I swear the sound of her heavy boots stomping could be heard across the whole neighborhood as she clomped onto my picnic table like she owned the place. Picture this. I'm trying to grill ribs in peace. My friends are here, and their kids, still grieving, just want to fish quietly. Then suddenly, this woman is towering over my food, barking orders like she's military police. My chest thudded with adrenaline. The kids' eyes were wet, on the edge of tears. "Tell me what you would have done, because I nearly lost it." Weekend mornings at the lake had always been my refuge. The hickory smoke from my grill curled into the air as ribs slowly cooked, while golden light stretched across the water. Wooden steps led down to where Dean had tied up his boat, ready for what should have been a calm, healing day. His kids, Lucy and Noah, stood at the shoreline with the kind of excitement only children feel about something as simple as fishing. I had no idea that serenity would shatter in moments. Dean carried tackle boxes while the kids bickered over who would use the lucky rod. Lucy, just 8, her pigtails bouncing, pointed eagerly toward the deeper water where she was sure the fish were waiting. Noah, 10 and trying hard to sound grown-up, lectured her on casting techniques like an expert, despite having seen exactly one video online. Their playful banter filled the air, and for the first time in months they looked genuinely happy. 3 months earlier, they'd lost their mother. This fishing day was meant to bring them comfort. Then, before the sharp crackle of the bullhorn even reached us, Malene stormed onto our deck and clambered right onto the picnic table, where our plates of ribs sat untouched. She stabbed her finger toward my guests, shouting about unauthorized visitors like she was issuing orders to soldiers. The kids froze, wide-eyed, as her shoe left a greasy mark on the tabletop. And if that wasn't enough, the bullhorn's shriek tore across the water, loud enough to send birds scattering from the trees. A rental canoe came barreling toward us, 3 adults paddling furiously under cheap safety patrol decals slapped crooked on the side. At the back sat Malene Pierce, dressed in a polo embroidered with Lake Wellness Day logos. She held that bullhorn like a weapon, her voice slicing through the calm. Unregistered guests must vacate the lake immediately under HOA emergency protocols. The 2 volunteers paddling looked uneasy, trading glances like they weren't sure this was what they signed up for. Malene's canoe cut directly across Dean's boat, blocking the path to open water. My stomach knotted as I watched Lucy and Noah inch closer together, their joy dissolving into confusion. Those children had endured enough grief. This nonsense was the last thing they needed. Dean's jaw tightened, the discipline of his military background flickering through him, but the presence of the kids held him back. These little ones didn't need to witness grown adults waging turf wars while still mourning their mother. The bullhorn blared again. Private watercraft require HOA approval for guest use. These children are creating liability risk for community residents. Her tone carried that false authority people use when they know they're overstepping but think volume can cover the cracks. The volunteers were visibly squirming now. One even set his paddle down, as if debating whether to keep going. I looked at Lucy and Noah. Their hands shook as they clutched the rods they had been so eager to use only minutes earlier. Seeing their fear lit something in me, something protective I hadn't expected. Whatever power games this HOA woman thought she was playing, I wasn't going to let her deepen those kids' wounds. When I spoke, my voice came out steadier than I felt. Every word was spaced, deliberate. "You're standing on private property." The words cut through the morning like a challenge. Malene opened her mouth, ready with another rehearsed speech about safety codes or community rules. But something in my tone, or maybe in the sheer certainty behind it, stopped her. Mid-word, she froze. Her paddle shook in her grip, her stare locked on me like she'd seen a ghost. Slowly, the bullhorn lowered. Her volunteers stopped rowing. Even the breeze seemed to still. Suddenly, her mock patrol looked absurd, like kids playing dress-up, exposed under the reality of actual property rights. The silence dragged on until the sound of water slapping against the dock seemed unnaturally loud. Then the lake level dipped just enough to reveal something I'd nearly forgotten. Faded boundary lines painted decades ago on the rock edge of my yard, left over from the original property survey. Malene's eyes followed mine. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by calculation. Her hands trembled as she raised her phone, and moments later, neighborhood phones buzzed with emergency alerts. That Sunday evening, during dinner, our phones blared again, making the whole family jump. The alert read, "Lake safety violation reported." Residents advised to monitor waterfront activity. I stared at the screen, wondering how emergency protocols somehow translated into harassing families on private land. Mia, my wife, used her experience as a county land records secretary to dig into our house files. Soon our kitchen table was covered with oversized photos from 1998 and repair receipts from 2002. She had an eye for small irregularities most people would miss. Crooked numbers, mismatched measurements, details others would skim over. She pointed to the evidence, then to Dean's video of the old survey marks revealed by the low water line. "These markings prove everything," she said firmly. "Every angle matches the approved construction plan from when you inherited the cabin." Dean, meticulous from his service background, pieced together the timeline with photo stamps. Noah, sharp for a 10-year-old, frowned at his tablet. "Uncle Clark," he said, "that emergency alert came from Miss Pierce's personal account." "Isn't that wrong?" The kid had picked up what the adults were only beginning to grasp. Emergency alerts were supposed to come from official county systems, not a private phone. That evening, a retired 911 dispatcher from down the street knocked on our door. She explained she'd received multiple alerts within just 3 hours, something that flat out violated every emergency protocol she'd followed during her career. "This breaks public safety rules," she said, with the weight of someone who had managed real crises. "Personal accounts can't broadcast emergency alerts to a whole community. That requires county authorization, and only under specific conditions." The gravity sank in. A child and a retired dispatcher had pieced together violations that the HOA chair herself didn't seem to understand. Malene wasn't just overstepping property lines, she was abusing emergency communication systems. Mia dug deeper, cross-checking HOA bylaws with municipal code. The bylaws claimed Malene had lake safety authority, but no such power existed in any county or state record. "Clark," Mia said with certainty, "this HOA is pretending its bylaws override actual government law. That authority doesn't exist." Dean's fishing trip had turned into an evidence-gathering mission. He documented the faded survey marks revealed by the receding water, carefully photographing their exact location against our property line. The markers lined up perfectly with the survey documents in our property file, confirming that our wooden steps were fully inside our legal boundaries. Even their angle matched the original building plans Mia had uncovered during her research. When I phoned the insurance company to report the harassment, the representative caught me off guard with unexpected news. "Mr. Rivers, we've already had 3 separate requests this week about your property. Someone's been asking about your liability coverage and restrictions on guests. That timing was no coincidence." Malene had started compiling a case against us long before she ever confronted us on the water. And the misuse of the emergency alert system turned out to be far more extensive than we realized. Our retired dispatcher neighbor showed us her call log. Alerts had come through at 2:15 p.m., 4:47 p.m., and 7:31 p.m. Every single one originated from Malene's personal account but was pushed through the county's official emergency channels. "This is federal communications fraud," our neighbor said darkly. "Emergency systems are protected under federal law." Lucy and Noah helped us trace the exact order of events. Their straightforward questions exposed flaws in Malene's version of the story that adults might have overlooked. "If she had emergency alerts, why did she use a bullhorn?" Lucy asked. "And why did she look so scared when you said it was private land?" Children can slice through layers of adult deception with simple, innocent logic. Maya's last discovery turned out to be the most incriminating: HOA bylaws that claimed authority over lake safety, powers not granted anywhere in county or municipal law. No government record showed homeowner associations being given that authority. "Clark, this HOA is claiming rights that legally don't exist," Mia repeated, the implications growing clearer as we sifted through each document. Malene wasn't just crossing boundaries. She was pretending to hold official power. By the second week, Malene had rolled out her neighborhood petition drive with the polish of someone who had planned her offensive long in advance. She went door to door, spreading fear about liability and safety risks. With a clipboard decorated in official-looking letterhead, she warned residents about the supposed dangers of waterfront activities. framing Dean's fishing trip as reckless instead of a healing retreat for grieving children. Her tactics were far more calculated than I'd expected. She told neighbors that my property claims endangered the entire community's home values, stirring anxiety about lawsuits and insurance hikes. She suggested that if I could claim rights to the lakefront, others might lose access to the shared amenities funded through HOA dues. Her arguments preyed on the fears homeowners carry about property values and legal exposure. Soon some neighbors wouldn't even meet my eyes when I went to get the mail. The cold shoulders felt deliberate, part of a strategy to make us feel unwelcome in our own neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson, who always waved from her garden, stood silently this time as Malene handed her a petition sheet. Even the mailman lingered to watch as signatures stacked up against us on her porch. One HOA board member confronted me at the grocery store, repeating the line that residents were worried about my aggressive behavior during the so-called peaceful confrontation. I wondered what version of events Malene had told, because shielding children from harassment was hardly aggression. "She's just trying to protect everyone's investment," he said, as if reciting a script. The concern sounded staged, rehearsed. Lucy and Noah noticed immediately. Children are quick to sense tension adults prefer to ignore. They whispered to each other, asking Dean whether they had done something wrong. One afternoon, Lucy even drew a picture of the lake with Malene's face crossed out, a painful sign of how much the hostility was weighing on them after losing their mother. Dean, with his military background, recognized the strategy. "She's cutting you off socially before shifting to other attacks," he explained as we watched neighbors cross the street to avoid us. Classic move to weaken resistance. He was probably right, but knowing the playbook didn't make living through it any easier. At last, a longtime neighbor who had witnessed the original boundary survey quietly spoke up. She remembered the county crew marking the borders decades earlier and confirmed our steps had always been inside the rightful lines. "I've lived here since 1973, she said softly. Those blue markers came from county surveyors, not homeowners inventing claims. Still, tensions hit their peak when 3 families demanded removal from the neighborhood watch group rather than serve alongside me. At a hastily arranged front yard meeting, Malene held her clipboard while neighbors signed their names in front of one another. The reasoning fell apart under scrutiny, but fear doesn't need consistency. The social strain was harder to endure than the legal or financial fights. I started to wonder if it was worth the disruption. Watching neighbors I'd known for years pick sides based on half-truths hurt deeply. Her tactics might have been working. In quiet moments, I caught myself thinking about compromise just to end the hostility, but then our neighbor revealed Malene's real objective. She had overheard her on the phone near the mailboxes, asking an event supplier about tents and sound systems for a future lakeside venue. The lake dispute wasn't about safety or property lines at all. It was a cover for a land grab. Soon after, Malene announced a special HOA assessment at the monthly community meeting, targeting my family specifically with costs for supposed shoreline maintenance. By the end of the second week, we received paperwork demanding $3,700 immediately for environmental impact mitigation. No other lakefront owner received similar charges. Even though many had larger or more invasive waterfront improvements, the precision of the move was audacious. HOA documents now claimed our wooden steps required environmental studies and unique upkeep, though no county official had ever required such measures. At the community hall, Dean laid out the invoices across the table and projected a reply from the listed company. "They've never heard of this project," he said, showing there was no supporting documentation. The paperwork cited violations that didn't exist and fabricated maintenance standards the county had never recognized. Malene waved her clipboard as if the rules were legitimate, but Mia countered with county maps pointing out exactly where Malene had made things up. Her grasp of municipal records exposed the falsifications for what they were, a targeted campaign. The timing was no accident. A surprise $30,700 bill could easily force a property sale if we couldn't cover it. Malene had shifted tactics, financial pressure where legal maneuvers had failed. The assessment carried a 30-day deadline, with interest and penalties accruing daily. Non-payment could result in liens or even foreclosure. Other neighbors soon discovered they were next in line. Anyone who sided with me risked their own trumped-up fees. Mrs. Rodriguez, for example, suddenly received a notice about pool maintenance charges for her above-ground pool, a pool that had sat in her yard for 12 years without a single fee. The warning was unmistakable. Back Clark and you'd be hit with fabricated financial penalties. When Mia pulled the county records, she uncovered budget discrepancies inside the HOA that exposed where the assessment money had actually gone. Funds meant for lake upkeep had been rerouted into event planning, with little oversight and no board authorization. Expenses for catering, entertainment rentals, and decorations were disguised as maintenance costs. In reality, the HOA had been inventing charges to bankroll Maline's event projects, without approval and without the community's consent. Dean dug further and learned that the environmental studies listed in my own assessment had never even been scheduled. During the HOA meeting, he held up his phone and played a recording of his call with the consulting firm. On the line, the representative stated flatly that no record existed of any Lake Wellness Day projects. "You're being billed for services that were never performed," Dean told the room. "This is fraudulent invoicing, hidden inside what's supposed to be a legitimate assessment." The deadline made the pressure immediate: 30 days to pay $3,700 for phantom services or face property liens and legal threats. The design was deliberate. It wasn't about fairness, but about fear. Maline was counting on financial anxiety to shut down rational scrutiny and force instant compliance. I began researching legal options to contest discriminatory assessments, but every avenue took months, all while interest and penalties kept piling up. The imbalance was intentional, immediate financial harm with delayed legal remedies. It was a calculated strategy to coerce payment before we could even mount a defense. Then the HOA treasurer contacted me privately, asking to meet away from any community space. She handed me records showing Maline's unauthorized spending on lake events, all charged to community funds without the board's consent. At the following open session, she finally spoke out, spreading receipts across the table. Catering, rental equipment, entertainment costs, all hidden under maintenance. "She's been treating HOA funds like her personal party budget," the treasurer admitted shakily. The documents confirmed a broader pattern of mismanagement, making my assessment part of a much larger abuse of the budget. Meanwhile, Dean was quietly packing up his fishing gear. He had overheard neighbors whispering about the problem family within earshot of Lucy and Noah. The kids stopped asking about fishing trips. Instead, they withdrew as though absorbing responsibility for tensions they couldn't begin to understand. Lucy no longer carried her lucky rod. She pressed her frustration into drawings of the lake, bold and angry. Noah asked, almost in a whisper, if we should leave before things got worse for Uncle Clark. Watching children in grief take on blame for adult conflicts was my breaking point. They were supposed to be healing from their mother's death, not carrying the weight of neighborhood hostility. Instead, their trauma was deepened by rejection, creating the exact opposite environment they needed. I watched Lucy bear down so hard with a crayon that it tore the paper, as if her 8-year-old mind had decided she was the cause of everyone's anger. The kids were suffering under the pressure far more than I was from the financial or legal battles. Noah, trying to shield his sister, suggested they could stay in Dean's hotel room instead of our guest bedroom. At just 10 years old, he was strategizing ways to reduce their presence for the sake of adults he loved. His protective instinct was heartbreaking. He should have been carefree, not compensating for neighborhood disputes. For the first time, I questioned whether continuing the fight was worth it. Watching grieving children internalize blame created more doubt than any legal threat. Maybe the cost to them was too high. Maybe peace mattered more than principle. That's when I overheard Maline herself. Passing her driveway, I caught her telling another board member that emotional pressure works faster than legal pressure, especially when kids are involved. Her words were cold, calculated. Those kids make the family vulnerable. Parents will cave to protect children from stress. The casual cruelty of weaponizing grieving children was more horrifying than any financial threat. Some neighbors started to speak out, uneasy at watching kids suffer for adult quarrels. A few parents even told me privately they'd testify if investigators ever looked into the false alerts, since their own children had been frightened by them. Family after family recognized that dragging kids into conflicts was crossing a line, and that put new pressure on Maline to explain why child welfare had been ignored. Dean, drawing on his military background, recognized the tactics immediately. "This is psychological warfare," he told me. "If you retreat now, you're rewarding bullying. It sets the precedent for her to do this to the next family who stands up to her. His point was valid. But hearing Lucy and Noah cry quietly in their room, strategy felt irrelevant. The priority was protecting them right now. The crisis of conscience reached its peak when Lucy looked at me and asked if we were bad people, because it seemed like everyone hated us. 8 years old, 3 months after losing her mother, and already demanding to know why the world was so unfair. Her innocent question pierced deeper than any lawsuit or debt notice. No child should sketch themselves as the villain, least of all children already staggering under grief. Noah tried to comfort her, telling her that adults sometimes fight over things kids can't make sense of. His words were tender but tragic. At 10, he already carried more wisdom about unfairness than he should. I stood torn between shielding the kid's fragile emotions and fighting for justice to prevent others from enduring this same torment. Either choice carried risk. Retreat might give them short-term peace but embolden future harassment. Fighting might prove us right but prolong their exposure to cruelty. Maybe you faced that kind of choice too, between preserving peace for family now or pushing forward for something bigger later. What would you have done? On the third Tuesday, everything shifted. Officer Mark Lewis showed up after formal complaints about abuse of the emergency alert system, but this time he wasn't alone. An FCC investigator stepped out with him, flashing a federal badge that immediately elevated the situation far beyond neighborhood disputes. She introduced herself as being with the Federal Communications Commission, the referee, for everything that runs on signals, from weather alerts to ordinary radio. And in that instant I realized this wasn't just about local politics anymore. This was federal. And once the FCC stepped in, the entire game changed. County code enforcement stepped in to examine the property lines and determine the scope of the HOA's authority. But when it came to federal violations, penalties were mandatory, unaffected by neighborhood politics. Local disputes gave way to professional investigation, as both officials gathered evidence with deliberate precision. Officer Lewis carefully photographed boundary markers, compared HOA bylaws with municipal codes, and highlighted gaps between what the HOA claimed as power and what the law actually allowed. Meanwhile, the FCC investigator narrowed her attention to violations of the emergency alert system. In front of the assembled residents, she projected Maline's phone records, displaying how her messages had been rerouted into official government channels. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Their organized, fact-driven approach stood in stark contrast to Maline's erratic campaign of harassment. County reports confirmed what Mia's earlier research had shown all along: our property lines were indisputable. The wooden steps sat fully within our rights, and the HOA's reach stopped at each homeowner's lot. Lewis documented that Maline's so-called Lake Safety Authority existed only within HOA paperwork, with no recognition from county or state governments. It was officially logged as an invented authority with no legal foundation, but the federal violations carried far more weight than boundary disputes. The FCC investigator presented proof of intentional misuse of emergency systems for personal vendettas, displaying screenshots of fake alerts while neighbors recorded the evidence on their phones. Emergency communications were safeguarded by federal law, and any personal exploitation triggered mandatory penalties that no local influence could soften. Even I was stunned at the severity of the federal charges. I submitted a complete evidence package: property records, harassment timeline, financial targeting, and communications violations. The escalation became undeniable when laid out step by step: physical intimidation, signal abuse, social manipulation, financial sabotage, and even emotional pressure directed at children. Each layer revealed a coordinated attempt to force us off the property through mounting harassment. As the community watched federal investigators press questions about communications fraud, they began to see that this was no longer just a neighborhood quarrel, but a matter of criminal law. The risk of criminal liability shifted community perception far more than any argument over survey lines ever had. The presence of federal officials shattered the illusion of legitimacy around Maline's campaign. Still, Maline clung to her story, making false claims to investigators despite mounting evidence. She shouted that the warnings had been justified by safety concerns. But when the FCC agent replayed her bullhorn announcement over loudspeakers, bitter laughter broke out among the crowd. The investigator pointed out that lying to federal officials during an inquiry could add new charges. On top of the existing communications violations, the evidence showed not random incidents but a calculated strategy: property confrontations, fraudulent alerts, financial manipulation, and social pressure, an orchestrated harassment campaign designed to force a sale. Federal investigators tied it together as a deliberate pattern, not spontaneous disputes. Dean's meticulous financial analysis backed this up, revealing targeted assessments, fabricated environmental inspections, maintenance demands that applied only to us, and HOA budget abuse funneling money into Maline's personal events. The financial fraud meshed with the communications abuse, proving a broad misuse of authority across multiple fronts. The FCC investigator announced her preliminary conclusions: a minimum $5,000 fine for signal violations, ongoing federal monitoring of communications, and possible criminal charges for deliberate system abuse. She read the penalties aloud through the microphone at the community center while residents filmed. Maline's campaign had officially crossed into federal crime, with unavoidable consequences. By the fourth week, she received formal citations. Case number EAS 2511138 confirmed the minimum $5,000 fine, permanent monitoring, and the looming possibility of criminal prosecution. Deputies stepped forward during the reading, removing her HOA badge in front of a stunned audience. The board immediately stripped her of all leadership roles to shield the community from liability. Accountability didn't stop at federal charges. Discriminatory assessments were voided, and affected families received compensation. Evidence of unauthorized spending forced Maline to personally reimburse community funds diverted to her events. County investigators confirmed our property lines, creating a permanent record that safeguarded our lakefront rights against future challenges. The community began healing once the investigation wrapped up. Neighbors offered apologies for being misled, some even speaking publicly to admit they'd been drawn into the manipulation. The property acquisition scheme was laid bare, revealing that Maline's supposed safety campaign was never about protection. Families expressed gratitude that the harassment was stopped before it spread further. Financial restitution followed, false environmental assessments reversed, legal fees reimbursed. During a public session, the treasurer projected corrected ledgers, acknowledging funds had been misused. County officials reinforced that environmental laws applied evenly across all properties and couldn't be twisted into tools of pressure by the HOA. The original survey markers, once a point of conflict, were confirmed as valid property boundaries. Federal protections for emergency communications set a precedent that would guard future families against similar abuse. With county and federal documentation in place, the foundation was stronger than ever. Lucy and Noah returned to fishing, this time joined by neighborhood kids who now offered companionship instead of hostility. What was once a battleground became a place of healing, helping them see the struggle as a lesson in justice, rather than a personal attack. Dean's disciplined documentation proved pivotal, turning scattered incidents into a prosecutable federal case. His methodical evidence work and financial breakdown created the structure needed for full accountability. The fishing retreat had evolved into something greater, a testament to standing against abuse of power. His precision was the key to ensuring lasting justice. The outcome delivered a definitive end, a federal criminal record that would follow Maline permanently, preventing her from repeating the same abuses elsewhere. Deputies escorted her out as cameras rolled, capturing her twisting away and shouting, "This isn't over." But federal monitoring of communications, mandatory restitution, and a permanent criminal record ensured her tactics could no longer be weaponized. The consequences reached into her future: housing applications, employment background checks, and public reputation now permanently scarred. The community, having seen the federal process firsthand, came to understand the line between legitimate authority and manipulative overreach. The children continued their healing in a safe, supportive place where justice stood as protection. The neighborhood itself transformed, no longer divided by fear but united in protecting rights. Justice felt warm, like sunlight glimmering across calm water. Federal law standing guard for families against those who exploit power. And in that moment, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe the real lesson is this: no matter how loud someone tries to silence the truth, it always finds a way to echo louder. If you made it this far, I'd love to hear how this video resonated with you and what I could improve. And if it connected with you, even a small word of encouragement means a lot as I keep building this channel. If you'd like to support, you can always tap the thanks button below. And of course,